Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode in a video series presented and funded by KupoCon, where I'll be exploring the Final Fantasy VII compilation lore and Easter eggs that appear in the remake. I'm MJ Gallagher, author of the unofficial Final Fantasy VII Novelisation, the standalone novel The Nibelheim Incident, which is now an audio series also produced by KupoCon, as well as my latest book, Norse Myths That Inspired Final Fantasy VII. The purpose of this series is to discuss a lot of the detail hidden within the remake, and to provide a broader understanding for new and veteran fans alike. In the last episode, I examined the opening to Chapter 14, titled In Search of Hope, focusing primarily on the alternative resolution scenes with Tifa, Barret and Aerith, and how these impact on the wider story. This time around, I'll mostly be analysing two particular subplots of Chapter 14, one that connects to the official novel The Kids Are Alright, and the other to the PlayStation 5 exclusive DLC, Episode Intermission. The video will inherently include spoilers for this section of the game, but anything beyond Chapter 14 is minimal and mainly speculation. However, as always, if you're not familiar with the original story, there will very likely be heavy spoilers. And if you're new to the channel, please don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Having received Elmira and Marlene's blessings to go rescue Aerith from Shinra headquarters, the party discusses the best way to make it to Midgar's plate, given that the city is currently in a state of emergency. With their options limited, Tifa proposes a visit to Don Corneo in order to source some information, so they set off for Wall Market. As the trio approaches the heart of Centre District, they discover that a crowd has gathered beneath the Jumbotron to listen to some news being shared by a young woman named Curie. While this might actually have been missed by fans already familiar with the novel The Kids Are Alright, and almost impossible to spot by those unfamiliar with the book, we have previously encountered Curie in Remake. She is the pickpocket in the busy train carriage at the end of Chapter 2, and can also be found outside 7th Heaven at the start of Chapter 3, trying to sell topside gossip about the Mako Reactor 1 bombing. To offer some context, Kyrie Kanan is one of the lead characters in The Kids Are Alright, authored by Final Fantasy VII's lead scenario writer Kazushige Nojima, where she owns a private detective agency. The book is set approximately 2 years after the original game, but precedes the events of Advent Children. In the story, details of her past are revealed, specifically noting that she was a petty thief and a con artist during this time period. Keep this in mind with respect to Kyrie's motives in Chapter 14, but I'll provide a much deeper explanation later in the video. As it happens, when the group arrives, Curie is spouting some fake news about Avalanche being responsible for the Sector 7 collapse. Her rationale here is that after the bombings of Mako Reactors 1 and 5, they went for Reactor 7, not caring about the collateral damage. She then gives the crowd her big scoop, that Wutai are funding Avalanche's activities. While this follows on from President Shinra's accusation in Chapter 7 that Avalanche and Wutai are allies, and Biggs' comment in Chapter 4 that the Avalanche Old Guard may have cut a deal with the nation, many players, myself included, assumed it was merely propaganda being fed to the public to generate support for the looming war. Barret and Tifa's reactions in particular indicate they believe Curie is lying, but I'll come back to that in a minute because the introduction of Episode Intermission has flipped things on their head. As Kyrie begins demanding payment for her gossip, one of the men in the crowd comments that Wutai is attacking Midgar because they want the reactors. This actually couldn't be further from the truth, because multiple official sources confirm that war first broke out 15 years ago, due to Wutai strongly opposing the construction of a reactor on its soil. Perhaps the game's developers wanted to use this as an example to highlight how Shinra Media's misinformation can influence public opinion. Anyway, as I mentioned, the context of this scene changed drastically when the trailer dropped in February 2021 for Intermission, the Remake DLC featuring Yuffie Kisaragi, further supplemented by details released by Square Enix regarding the episode's synopsis and characters. Specifically, it has now been confirmed that the Wutai government itself has greenlit a covert operation for Yuffie, a member of Wutai's elite ninja corps, the Shinobi, to infiltrate Midgar and team up with Avalanche HQ. As we know from the loading screen panels throughout Remake, Avalanche HQ is the core non-militant branch of the organisation, distinct from, and predating, Barrett's Splinter Cell. It therefore means that Kurie's gossip in this case is actually true, and not simply Shinra propaganda. As for whether it's a lucky guess on Kurie's part, or she somehow learns about it during a cameo in Intermission, we'll find out soon enough. As I discussed way back in episode 3 of this series, it may not have been obvious to casual players of the original Final Fantasy VII, especially in the international versions of the game, that Barrett was not the founder of Avalanche. The Ultimania Omega further clarifies that his group was not even its first incarnation. As it happens, the larger organisation are the main antagonists of Before Crisis, with that game providing a basic history for them. The so-called Old Guard Avalanche cell that appears in Chapter 4 of Remake seems to be derived from the terrorist faction of Before Crisis, based on their military-grade uniforms and weapons. The inclusion of not one, but 3 Avalanche groups in Remake, those of course being Barrett's Cell, HQ and the Old Guard respectively, is likely to have confused many fans. That said, their addition was actually shown to us as far back as, wait for it, the Final Fantasy VII Remake reveal trailer in 2015. Remember those soldiers running up the rain-soaked steps in one of Midgar's topside facilities? The red bands tied around their arms match the Avalanche combatants of Before Crisis, as well as the Old Guard troops that turn up in Chapter 4. As I noted in my video covering that chapter, a similar trait has also been adopted by Biggs, Wedge and Jesse, who all wear theirs as a bandana. On a related topic, having Wutai operatives carrying out anti-Shinra activities in Midgar is not new to episode Intermission. As I spoke about in the second part of my Chapter 8 video trilogy, there is a collection of soldier side missions in Crisis Core dedicated to eliminating a Wutai spy ring, with Crescent Unit scouts hiding out right here in the Sector 5 slums. As a caveat to that though, they are remnants of the Wutai army and no longer following the command of the nation's leaders. Yuffie's assignment in Intermission, on the other hand, is the first verified instance in the compilation of Final Fantasy VII of orders like this coming from the top. The presence of foreign operatives in Sector 5 is possibly even alluded to by one of the NPCs beneath the Jumbotron, where she comments, "Bet you can spot them by their Wutai clothing," which does actually reflect the distinct garb worn by the character Sonon Kusakabe during Intermission. As a side note, the music that's been playing in the background during this part of the video is the Wutai track that's one of the game's jukebox collectibles. This can be picked up in Chapter 14 from the cellar in the Urban Advancement District behind Don Corneo's mansion, an area that I'll speak about more in the next episode. Like I touched on earlier, Barrett's reaction to Kurie's gossip regarding Wutai's relationship with Avalanche is one of anger and denial, strongly suggesting he is unaware of HQ's team-up with Yuffie. The message is further accentuated by the Shinra news broadcast that announces the company has determined it was Avalanche who orchestrated the collapse of the Sector 7 plate, and that they intend to investigate the extent to which Wutai was involved in the tragedy. Again, it's clear the local residents are buying into the narrative, which does make sense from a lore perspective. In the Ultimania Omega and other media released after Final Fantasy VII, official timelines note that the leader of Avalanche had been assassinated 2 months prior to the bombing of Mako Reactor 1. Before Crisis revealed this event to be the alleged murder of Elfa, which Sung in fact faked. To the public, it would likely seem that Avalanche bringing down the Sector 7 plate was retaliation. But how does all this tie into the Sector 5 slums? What connects this place to Wutai, Avalanche, and the Yuffie DLC? Well, in addition to what I've already mentioned regarding the Crescent Unit scouts hiding out in Sector 5, the related mission briefs in Crisis Core even go as far as to say the Wutai remnants have joined forces with other anti-Shinra factions. And, as either chance or very sophisticated writing would have it, Remake itself confirms that at least one branch of Avalanche is based in Sector 5. At this time, I would like to thank my good friend and compilation video essayist Sleepeasy for highlighting the latter to me, because it was the linchpin for what I'm about to discuss. Sleepeasy has researched this particular topic far more extensively than I have, and his YouTube feature on Episode Intermission is an absolute masterclass in theory crafting. Anyway, during Chapter 5, Barrett comments that their friends in Sector 5 marked the route through the railway tunnels, referring to the stamp graffiti. As I spoke about in the last episode, obtaining Barrett's resolution scene at the start of Chapter 14 will reveal that all the stamp artwork was put up by a young Avalanche member named Finn, who may or may not be the same character as Polk from Intermission. Polk, like the other Avalanche HQ members Neo, Billy Bob and Zhuzhe, all of whom have been given official biographies on Square Enix's website, is specifically said to be hiding in Sector 7 during this time period. Interestingly, there is already a location in the Sector 5 slums which has been associated with Avalanche members, and that is the Leaf House Orphanage. As I pointed out in my Chapter 8 videos, Miss Folia tells Cloud that her predecessor was Biggs, while two of the children studying outside the building talk about Biggs and Jessie coming to help them learn. Most of the NPCs in and around the Leaf House during Chapter 8 have dialogue, openly discussing many things in front of Cloud. I find it curious then that not a single one, has anything to say to the party in Chapter 14. It's absolutely possible that this is just down to the limitations on game development, but those who have completed the remake may see a connection between why the children are keeping quiet in wake of the alleged Avalanche attack, and who is sleeping upstairs in the orphanage at this moment. And, as one final piece of speculative evidence, in my last video I briefly touched on the possibility that Polk, Neo and Billy Bob are actually the codenames used by Avalanche members Finn, Nelly and Al, the trio Barrett speaks about in his resolution scene. This is supported in the bio of the character Zhuzhe, published in a Famitsu article in April 2021. Zhuzhe is an Avalanche liaison to Wutai and tells Yuffie and Sonon they have been given the codename Yu. Assuming then that Zhuzhe is working with Finn, Nelly and Al, who are in turn the friends from Sector 5 that Barrett references in Chapter 5 of Remake, and that there's an established link between Avalanche and the Leaf House through Biggs, it would certainly help to explain why the initials A for Al, N for Nelly, and Z for Zhuzhe appear on the calendar at the orphanage. Later in the chapter, if the player elects to explore and take on some side quests, they will discover Johnny hanging around the Sector 5 train station. He seems pretty upset and goes on to reveal that he's trying to leave town, but his wallet got stolen by a tomboy bandit. When Cloud asks him to describe the thief, Johnny identifies Curie and points them in the direction of the church. Back in the first of my 3 episodes covering Remake's Chapter 8, I spoke a little bit about the area surrounding the church. In reference to the dilapidated buildings, I suggested that they are likely the remnants of a town that existed before Midgar was built. This was based on Jessie's remarks during the original Final Fantasy VII, when she shows Cloud a 3D map of the city and states that the 8 sectors used to be individual towns, but no one can remember their names. I also assumed that the church itself was pretty old, but I was either wrong or its history has been retconned. In the Remake's Material Ultimania, lead environment artist Akiyoshi Tamanoi provides a snippet of in-game lore. He advises that during Midgar's construction, the area that is now Sector 5 was a place to procure building materials for the plate. However, the harsh working conditions caused casualties, and the church was erected as somewhere that memorial services or spiritual healing for the workers could take place. Therefore, rather than being an archaic building, the church is only around 30 years old. It's also unclear if the memorial services mentioned by Tamanoi-san relate specifically to the historic Sector 6 plate collapse, or just the general conditions of the plate's construction, but I'll talk a bit more about that in my Chapter 15 video. Thank you once again to my friend and fellow lore enthusiast Schrodinger's Baby Seal for bringing this detail to my attention. Seeing Barrett enter the church with Cloud at this time offers another callback to the character wallpaper art that I touched on in the last episode, but also creates a minor retcon. Both the original Final Fantasy VII and Remake produced artwork showing Barrett carrying Marlene on his shoulders in the church. Curiously, the pair never appeared together here in the old game, and it's only after the player obtains a key to the city much later in the story that Barrett himself can actually visit. Barrett and Marlene do show up here at the end of Advent Children though, and part of the photograph taken to commemorate that moment is, somehow, on the fridge at 7th Heaven earlier in Remake, as I highlighted in my Chapter 3 and 12 videos. Towards the rear of the nave, Kyrie stands admiring the flower bed that Cloud fell onto at the beginning of Chapter 8. Before we get into the young thief's story, I'd like to talk a little bit about the flowers themselves. It's been my understanding for many years that the reason they flourish here is down to Aerith's Cetran ability to talk with and heal the planet. That, however, as it turns out, is only part of the puzzle. During gameplay footage shown in May 2021 of the mobile battle royale game The First Soldier, itself set approximately 30 years prior to Final Fantasy VII, we saw players accessing the church. The flower bed is already in full bloom, which is likely just an asset carried over from the remake's design model. However, Tetsuya Nomura clarified that the Battle Royale map is part of a VR simulator, which has the capacity to anticipate future environments. Thank you as always to Itakamochi for translating that for us. Nomura-san's comments do cast some doubt over the time period that the flowers likely emerged, but their presence during the First Soldier would indicate this predates Aerith escaping to the slums 15 years ago. A line from Crisis Core further supports this, when Aerith tells Zack that the flowers only grow at the church, and that she had planted the ones in her garden. In an interview with the Square Enix North American team though, Final Fantasy VII Remake's co-director Motomu Toriyama stated that the river running past Aerith's house brings nutrients from the livestream to both her garden and the church. He then goes on to imply that Aerith being a Cetra is also a contributing factor, meaning there's far more at play here than meets the eye. A big thank you to Twitter user Sharba for highlighting this to me. When Cloud, Tifa and Barrett finally confront Curie, she denies knowing anything about a girl by that name, then relaxes when she realises the party are not the ones chasing her in relation to an overnight robbery. As I mentioned earlier, while Kyrie Kanan may be a new character to many fans, she is not new to the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, and has a lead role in the official novel The Kids Are Alright. Anyone listening out for music cues in this scene may have spotted that the track playing in the background is Shinra Creed, the remake's version of Mark of a Traitor, which first appears in the game on the train at the end of Chapter 2, just as Kyrie does. Anyway, during The Kids Are Alright, Kyrie runs a private detective agency, the name of which I'll come back to. Her work colleagues include Evan Townsend, who is later revealed to be an illegitimate son of President Shinra, and Leslie Kyle, currently employed by Don Corneo, who I'll talk more about in the next video. Kyrie and Evan initially meet on the plate in the aftermath of Meteor Fall, but she steals from him and leaves him at the Sector 5 train station, the very same location at which the party just found the mugged Johnny. It's also worth pointing out that the Crescent Moon accessory Kyrie has on her belt is exactly the same as the one Evan wears on his hat in The Kids Are Alright, though the book's character artwork confirms they do so simultaneously. A brief glimpse into Kyrie's past is offered during the story. She was born right here in the Sector 5 slums, and is 17 at the time of Remake. Both her parents were pickpockets that operated out of the Undercity, where her mum had learned to be a thief from her mother, Kyrie's grandma. The girl's parents were brutally murdered when she was a child because they stole a man's wallet. It's not made explicit in the book, but there is a suggestion that this man belonged to the Mafia. Kyrie was thereafter raised by her grandmother, and she too was taught the tricks of the con artist trade, developing into an accomplished pickpocket by the time of Final Fantasy VII. According to Remake's Ultimanias, her home is still located in Sector 5. During the present conversation, she discloses that she has unwittingly stolen from Shinra and needs help in getting the heat off her. Specifically, she has stolen a key, which I'll talk more about in the next video, that belonged to Corneo, hinting at her hatred of the Wall Market Mafia, who may or may not have been involved in her parents' death. Cloud, Tifa and Barrett see right through Kyrie's exaggerated pleas for protection, but agree to fight a battle for her at the Colosseum in exchange for Johnny's wallet and the stolen key. At this time, some of you may be wondering why Kyrie has chosen to come to the church. While it's not the most practical place in terms of secrecy, there is a good reason, and it more broadly references her relationship with Aerith. The Kids Are Alright divulges that the two were acquainted when they were younger. Kyrie and her friends would regularly play here while Aerith tended the flowers. In fact, the day Kyrie's parents died, Aerith had urged her to return home because she knew something was wrong. This reflects the flashback where Aerith tells Elmira her husband has been killed, and his spirit has returned to the planet. Kurie's grandmother had already explained about the livestream and etc., so she figured out that her friend was an ancient. The girl's hostile reaction to Aerith's secret was what led to the two falling out. However, Curie never forgot about Aerith, so when she establishes her detective agency to help search for missing people in the wake of Meteorfall, and make a profit doing so, she takes inspiration from the Cetra. The selling point of the business is actually an elaborate con. Curie tells her clients that she can tap into the livestream's currents to find people and items, just as Aerith could speak with the planet. By that time, the local populace is desperate to locate loved ones and far more receptive to the idea of the livestream, because many of them witnessed it surge from the Earth in a bid to stop Meteor. Even more outrageously, when Curie gives her clients readings, she is always dressed in a hooded black robe and barefoot, which sounds uncannily like the man with the number 2 tattoo who is seen wandering around in Sector 5 during Chapter 8 of Remake. Curie even tells Rude in The Kids Are Alright that she was aware the Turks were monitoring Aerith, with Rude later remarking that Curie reminds him of her. That said, there's certainly more complexity to Curie's character than one might assume. A prime example is that despite behaving like a bit of an ass to Cloud and the others in this scene, the book reveals that she stopped playing at the church after she fell out with Aerith, but finally went back following the collapse of the Sector 7 plate. Curie's reason for this is that she hoped to pick some flowers for the people who had died, which is likely what she was doing when the party arrived. One final thing to point out here is that while the characters are relative strangers right now, in the future, Curie, Evan and Leslie make the new 7th Heaven and Edge their regular meeting place. That establishment, of course, is co-owned by Tifa, Cloud and Barrett. When the trio returns from the Colosseum, having battled Don Corneo's lackey, Beastmaster, and the two-headed monster, Hellhound, to settle Curie's debt, Barrett asks if she has learned her lesson. Curie responds by saying she'll only ever steal from the right people in future, which may be another callback to how her parents were killed. It might have come as a surprise to those unfamiliar with The Kids Are Alright that Curie's grandmother is, in fact, Miri, who was last encountered in Chapter 9. Admittedly though, I did spill the beans on their relationship in a couple of my earlier videos. What I've also previously mentioned is that Curie's detective agency is named Miri's Investigative Services after her grandma, herself a career con artist. It is further revealed during this conversation that Miri is actually the infamous guardian angel of the slums, and she tells Curie that even a thief needs principles. This is yet another reference to a point I made in my 3rd Chapter 9 episode, where, during The Kids Are Alright, Evan recalls that Miri was very angry with her granddaughter for targeting him as an easy individual to steal from, highlighting that their code as con artists was only to take advantage of those who deserved it. Sadly, Miri, whose official surname is Dudley by the way, dies of a non-geostigma related illness within a year of Meteorfall. It hits Curie pretty hard, and there are a couple of subtle references in the novel about lingering emotions, which we can only now fully appreciate thanks to Final Fantasy VII Remake. One of these is that when Evan and Curie prepare to leave Edge in their car, she is wearing motorcycle goggles and a knitted hat, and has a large khaki backpack with her. While it meant little to readers when the book was first published in 2011, all of these are now seen on Miri's character design in Remake. And finally, having retrieved Johnny's wallet from the so-called tomboy bandit, he reaffirms to the party that he will now be leaving Midgar, albeit admitting that he could be persuaded otherwise. This reflects the original Final Fantasy VII, where he stops by the Honeybee Inn in Wallmarket for one last hurrah, before setting off around the world. Co-director Toriyama-san is quoted in the material Ultimania as saying he wants the character to appear again in a future instalment. In the old game, the player next encounters Johnny in Costa del Sol, which might explain why the jukebox disc for the Costa del Sol theme can be purchased a short way down the road in Centre District. Alternatively, when Curie is introduced in The Kids Are Alright, Evan describes her as looking like she might be singing to herself, speculating that it's the jingle from ads for the holiday resort. Either explanation ties very nicely into the events of this particular side quest. And, while we're on the subject of jukebox music, one of the NPCs beside Johnny has a version of the track Descendant of Shinobi playing, which happens to be Yuffie Kisaragi's theme. This brings us neatly back to episode intermission and Kirie's remarks earlier in the chapter about Wutai affecting life in Midgar through Avalanche. Back in the second of my videos covering Remake's Chapter 8, I briefly touched on another jukebox disc that can be picked up at the Sector 5 station. That, of course, was Kate Sith's theme. At this time, I still don't have a solid explanation for its presence, but perhaps episode intermission will provide us with an answer to that too. Well folks, this has been my recap of the compilation lore and Easter eggs from the Wutai and Curie Kanan subplots of Chapter 14. I hope you've enjoyed it, and please be sure to leave a comment with any feedback or something you think I've missed. If you haven't already done so, I invite you to check out my own Patreon account, where you'll find free downloads to my unofficial novelisation of Final Fantasy VII, the Nibelheim Instant, and so much more. Subscribers also get access to a huge amount of original content as well, including project artwork, behind the scenes podcasts, or mythology and Final Fantasy articles, etc. And please consider picking up a copy of my book, Norse Myths That Inspired Final Fantasy VII, which will soon also be available in hardback. I would like to thank KupoCon for commissioning this video series and encourage all viewers to support their channel and brand. But until next time, take care. I'm MJ Gallagher, and I'll speak to you again soon.